Hello. I only got one light on. I don't know, let's make it more moody. Less moody? More dramatic? Yeah. Still got the two lava lamps on. People say, you can't put two lava lamps on the fireplace because it's overkill. I'm like, okay. um, had a live stream last night. I've had more than a few live streams. Got into the really deep subjects. And then invariably the topic will diverge into something far more provincial. And by that I mean pedestrian. You can't please everybody. If you actually talk about the stuff that a lot of people want to talk about, it makes them happy, but the people that want to stay on the super serious topics, it makes them unhappy. But if you say on the super serious topics, then the people that want to talk about the more superficial things, they get upset. So I think I've done more live streams than anybody, but there's no perfect answer to that. It's kind of hard to do both. I wanted to talk about polarity and division, and it's an extremely important topic, and nobody talks about it. The only person that ever, and I've got resources. I got 14 terabytes of books. Yes, 14 terabytes, not gigabytes, terabytes. The only person that makes diagrams or talks about it accurately is Walter Russell. Even he fully doesn't understand polarity. He never, ever explains. He gets moderately close, never understands magnetism, which is fine. Nobody else did either except for me. But the division, all natural division, not regular division, like where I take this rock and I divide it, and that's obviously not a division of something transcendent, but all natural division is a division of something transcendent. Interestingly enough, as I mentioned 1,000 times, there's no branch of science or academia that has ever defined the word field or energy, and they have absolutely no idea what light is. The fundamental cosmic mechanics of this universe necessitates that you actually understand what energy is and what a field is, and also, too, what magnetism is. They'll tell you, sure, we've defined energy. It's the ability to do work. Well, that's descriptive, and it's descriptively accurate, but it is not explicative. It means it doesn't actually explain what energy is. I wanted to get into the primary principles of polarity in this universe, and they're incredibly important. And you can't actually understand cosmic mechanics without actually understanding polarity. I've said a million times that a magnet actually doesn't have two poles. I'd like to get into that in a little bit. But the principles of, for example, not starting anywhere specific, male and female, for example. The division of one unified whole. I mean, why is that the case? That's always, certainly not always the case in nature. But between higher creatures, it is necessitated. Of course, the Greek had a word for that, which is ananke, but it doesn't mean necessity. It means it can't exist any other way. And also, too, it's the most natural thing. And I'm no fan of the Bible, and I don't put any faith or trust in the Bible at all, but I know people want to quote the Bible, and I've never heard any Christian talk about this fact. They said that man is created in the image of God. But if that were the case and God were a unified whole, then there wouldn't be a natural archetype of the divine or of God. Not that I posit that the absolute is sentient being, which of course it is not. That is a creationistic fallacy idea. But then you'd actually have to ask a creationist, therefore, necessitatively and undeniably, there is an archetype of division within the one or the divine or God, because he didn't create Adam and Adam. Just one atom that, like Adam, one gender. At 30 years of age, Adam would, spontaneously give birth, right? No, it was Adam and Eve. At some point in time, the creationists, and all their countless fallacies, and of course creationism is a fallacy, they have to confess that, well, obviously humans were created in the image of God, but they never get to the point where they explain the natural division or plurality, or the archetype that if man were created in the image of the divine, that why is there, male and female? I'm not interested in answering that question because it's like arguing over the color of unicorns. Are unicorns, Are they gray or white or, well, they don't exist. It's completely senseless to argue about something that is fundamentally senseless. But this idea of polarity, and I've said this a million times, and people really don't get it, and it's incredibly important before getting into the deeper aspects of polarity and division, is that the opposite of the two things that people think that's all there is. Over here you have the atomists / the atheists. True atheism, by the way, is called metaphysical atheism. You should go look that up. Nihilism, materialism, atheism, it's all the exact same thing. And over here you have the creationists. They just think there's that. Well, you believe there's nothing or just matter. Everything is just a cosmic accident. Kind of like a million monkeys pounding on typewriters will eventually produce, 24 volume of Encyclopedia Britannica, which we all know is totally impossible, yet that's what the nihilist / materialist / atheist says. They'll actually work their way back to energy, but they can't define energy. So where did it all start? Where's the absolute apex? Where all of this materialistic, non-God garbage that you profess to believe in, which is itself a different type of religion. Well, it all started at energy, so you can't even define energy. Nihil ex nihilo, which means from nothing comes nothing. So ultimately they'll point out the splinter in the creationist eye, but they'll completely ignore the log in their own eye. And on the other hand, over here you have the creationists. The complete opposite to both of those things is something called emanationism. In Greek the word is called prohodos. Indian metaphysics, Advaita Vedanta, the Upanishads, original Buddhism, and I do mean original. Platonism, Pythagoreanism, Neoplatonism, Plotinus, Syrianism, all of that stuff is emanationism, which is the complete opposite of both. Yeah, kind of like the plane of inertia on a magnet. You got a pole over here, and you got a pole over here, and right here you have this white line right down the middle that's the opposite of both, but there is no magnetic flux, because a magnet doesn't actually have polarity. It's the division of the undivided transcendent principle of energy, because at the center of a magnetic field there is no magnetism. That's not my opinion, that's a fact, by the way. Modulation itself, of course, is polarity. Electrical and magnetic, relative to the circuit of light, is a polarity. We even talk about polarized light and light polarizing lenses. It will actually block out 90 degrees of light, and you actually cut them to be in the glasses, which I did for years, and it polarizes out the light. The pulse perturbation of light itself is polarity. There is actually dual polarity, which confuses people. I mean, talking about polarity confuses most people. Then you talk about dual polarity. Light, of course, is a dual polarity. You have a longitudinal pulse perturbation, and light itself is a pinch wrinkle. Everybody knows what a pinch is, and everybody knows what a wrinkle is. Well, this pinch, which is rarefaction and compression, which is longitudinal, is one polarity, and light is just a compound ether perturbation modality, or a circuit of light. And then you have radial polarization, or the other half of the dual polarity of light. This radial polarization is the electromagnetic field, which is tied to the longitudinal. The longitudinal is tied to the transverse. So you actually have transverse polarity and you have longitudinal polarity, because the pulse perturbation, and this is where they get the idea of the photon actually coming from, like this little blob of wax would be a photon. You have a string of these. Each one of them is tied to a radial polarization. And so you actually have this compound circuit, kind of like an accordion. But you'd have to think of a multi-dimensional accordion. Wherever you pull it out this way, it actually stretches this way. And as this contracts, this expands. And so you actually have this expression of dual polarity of the circuit of light. And it's really very simple. Magnetism itself, of course, is a dual polarity. You actually have the polarity of the magnetic field, which of course is a torus. Well, like this is. This, of course, is a torus. And then you actually have the other polarity of the dielectric, which is the centripetal. So you actually have this centrifugal, centripetal that are actually pulsing in complete unified harmony, because the magnetism is the dielectric field, and this, of course, is the fundamental yin-yang of the universe. You actually have the polarity of either one of these black holes, on either side of the magnetic field, which is the portal of the dielectrics. You actually have the centripetal and the centrifugal. So you have this radial polarity relative to the strength of the magnetic field, and you have this longitudinal polarity. This actual hole will expand or contract relative to the power of the field, so you have this conjugate dual polarity. But regular polarity, of course, confuses people. But just keeping it to simplex polarity, and like talking about the magnetic field. Here we have the unified hole where nothing is. Here we actually have a different polarity, which would be analogous to the black hole on either side of the magnet. I know this is a wire. And you actually have this radial polarity, which is analogous to the transverse electromagnetic in case of light. And over here, of course, you'd actually have this pulse perturbation along the longitudinal of its propagation. But this dual polarity of light is actually very simple, just kind of like a multi-dimensional accordion. However you compress it this way, it'll actually contract, and as this expands, this contracts and vice versa. So you actually have this conjugate principle of dual polarity. And this, of course, is where we get precession, and where we get time, and where we get lag. People in live stream last night were actually talking about a black hole, and a black hole was super simple. I told them to envision a shower head and a drain, where if you were able to turn the pressure up on the shower head, not that a shower works that way, the water would start to curve towards the drain, and no water would fall on top of your head, and people don't get that. The more powerful a magnet, the smaller the spatial the magnetic field is, because magnetism is the dielectric field. Wherever you increase one, you actually decrease the other. This is the reason why the largest magnetic field spatially outside of the magnet is at like an N40 or N45 Gauss. When you start talking about N55, N60, N62 Gauss magnets, what happens is the magnetic field shrinks because the power of the magnet is not in the magnetism itself, which really confuses people, but rather in the dielectric. That hole on either side of the magnet, it would be the puppet master, and the magnetic field itself is the puppet. Where you increase one, you actually affect the other. And this, of course, is the principle of dual polarity. The term negative charge, there's not a negative, well, this is a negative charge over here. You see it's marked by red. Well, a negative charge is not in accord with the laws of motion or of natural mechanics. The positive charges and the negative discharges. It's a discharge node or a ground or a counter space. This is a complete circuit. There is no one without the other. You can't separate out magnetism from the dielectric in the case of a magnet. It doesn't work that way. The anode, the charging anode, or the power thereof, or what you call the positive charge of a battery, would be analogous to that black hole on either side of the magnet, where there's actually very low magnetic flux. And at the center of the magnet, where it's most potent, which would be rest analogously, there is no magnetic flux. The discharge node is the discharge of that energy, which of course manifests as centrifugal force. And of course, if you tap off a battery, you make things turn and move, which is what you use a battery for. You're harvesting force off of rest. Not a perfect analogy to the ether or the magnetic and the dielectric, but it's extremely close. The name of the great divider of rest, and rest would be analogous to ground, to counter space, to the ether, you take your pick, is this two-way electrical motion that's called polarity. The same is true from absolutely everything in our visible universe all the way to the transcendent one, i.e. the ether. And like I said, if we actually superimprint the Bible, not that I put any faith or anything in that, it's like, well, there wasn't like man and female. Then you have this antecedent principle of the divine where there is always two of something to make something happen. Like, sure, like a magnet. A magnet has a north pole and a south pole. Really, it doesn't. The North Pole and the South Pole are actually the extrapolation of the discharge of rest energy. Yeah. If I actually create an arc current or make a circuit with this battery, for example, I'll actually have an expanding force bubble powering a fan or powering something that's moving that actually has a centrifugal volume. That itself is a dissipation of rest or energy. So we actually have rest and we have force. Force is a dissipation of rest, but all force vectors are curvilinear. If I'm actually able to hold this sideways, you can actually see the curvilinear vectors of this torus. It's kind of hard to hold it sideways there. The reason why it's always curvilinear because all force is tied to rest. It's the same reason why the magnetic field looks like that underneath the supercell. You see these curvilinear force vectors like a spirograph pattern or the dream catcher pattern. It's called a hypertrochoidal pattern. It's curvilinear like that because it's always tied right here at the center where there's that black spot. That's where no magnetism exists, but all magnetism comes from there. It's not true polarity in the sense, well, you got this over here and this over here. This is also, too, the fundamental principle behind the absolute, only rational, only logical, only intelligent, only accurate model of the universe, which is embodied by the emanationistic philosophy and metaphysics of the things that I was talking about 5 minutes ago. Advaita Vedanta, the Upanishads, original Buddhism, and I do mean original, okay, not the stuff that calls itself Buddhism today. The writings of Plotinus, Cyrianus, Damascius, Proclus, the Pythagoreans, all of that is emanationism. First reason why the first two digits of the Fibonacci sequence are 1 and 1 is not a separate one or an autonomous one. It's the attribute of the one. Nothing in this universe is real or unreal without an attribute. Light and illumination, principle and attribute. The first one and the second one are not two different ones. They're a unified holos. This is one of the core you can't understand emanationism. You can't understand Pythagoreanism without understanding this. A unified whole of principle and attribute. It's not a separate one, it's the attribute of the one, like light and illumination, which people think is the same thing, but it's not. That illumination is the activity, or the genesis, or the demiurge of the first one, which is principle or light. This battery is not hooked up to a light bulb. I can obviously hook it up to a light bulb, which would complete a circuit, and then the light bulb would be turned on, right? Then I would actually have the attribution of the dissipation of rest, which would, of course, be illumination at XYZ frequency. I could power a laser with this, I could power a light bulb, and power anything with it. But this would be analogous to the first one, and creating the circuit and tapping off of it would be analogous to the second one, where we actually have manifestation. This is not true polarity, which denotatively means two things. You know, there's no such thing as a monopole, by the way, which is ridiculous. There's not a person in this whole universe that could think of a monopole, because if you posit one end, you posit the other end. When I hear monopole, I really laugh internally, because you can't even think of a one-ended pole. It's impossible. You got one end, you have the other end. Male, female, likeness of God. So this archetype division is well within the scope of the divine. If you actually want to superimpose creationism on top of that, which I don't, but a lot of people might find it easier as an analogy for visualization. At the center of all magnetic fields, there is no magnetism. At the center of gravity, there is no gravity. Retroductive logic necessitates that there is only one field, that being the dielectric. There is no north pole or south pole in a magnet. You can't slice the two apart from one another. You can't take any magnet and separate. I'm going to slice it in the middle. I'm going to have a north pole over here and a south pole over here. It's impossible to do that. I don't know if you know that. You just end up with two new magnets. It's impossible to separate it. There's no Cartesian value of polarity in a magnet. No location, no midpoint. And this is the secret of incommensurability, by the way, which is a matter for another video, and it takes a long time to explain, even though it's super simple. There's no so-called block wall. There's no there, meaning a place where you could point to where, you know, here's the North Pole and here's the South Pole. Well, as it sits, that's true, but if I separate it out, then this innermost part of the North Pole becomes the South Pole. So this incommensurable field, which is just simplex pressure mediation, is divided again, kind of like taking a large bathtub and, you know, somehow dividing it. You just end up with two new bathtubs that are slightly smaller, half the size, if you will. You can't divide polarity out on a magnet. But people don't understand what magnetism is. They don't understand what the field is. They don't understand what defines magnetism. Magnetism is the attributional side of the dielectric, of the ether. There's a reason why there's that black hole. There you go, that black hole right at the center of every magnetic field seen underneath the supercell. That's rest. Here's the dielectric, and here's the magnetic field. Well, this is all one thing. You actually have rest, the transcendent one. Over here you have the attribute, and here you actually have the curved linear force vector. This amazes people. This doesn't amaze really anybody, and this doesn't amaze anybody at all. But, well, there's nothing there. How's that supposed to amaze me? What are you looking at? There's nothing there. It's like, yeah, right here is the rest point. You can't see it. This is where all the energy comes from. This is energy definitionally. This would be the first one. This is kind of like 1.5. However, that's not a perfect analogy. And here's the second one, principle and attribute. This has a frequency. Light and illumination, principle and attribute. That would be the demiurge. All of this is divinely simple. The two selves. Every hardcore serious metaphysics, Greek, Indian, and Egyptian, speak of the two selves. The meat suit self, the thing in the bathroom mirror, and the transcendent self. Same here. This would be the eminent self that comes out of the speaker.
22,
also, too, the conglomerate self of the radio and the antenna. And the transcendent self, that's me throwing this radio away, and the signal which is everywhere and nowhere. Transcendent self, which would be the first one. And here is the immanent self, the consubstantial, the attributional self, the force self. Because no frequency can be tuned, no energy can be tuned, without a frequency. That frequency is a modulation. It is the disturbance. All disturbance is attributional. This is a division between rest and force. Force and motion, inertia and acceleration. As I've said a million times, Mother Nature's a hairy armpit chick. She doesn't have a calculator. She has... People say, math doesn't lie. Math doesn't tell the truth either. There is no math in natural mechanics. There's only fields and field pressures. Ether and space. Space and gravity technically are polarities. But space itself is a negative image of pure potential. Literally, it's the impotency of the ether. It's a negative image of the ether. Shadow is not the opposite of light. Shadow is the absence of light. Absence or privation is not an opposite or a polarity to principle. It's the absence thereof. But that also, too, confuses human beings. All motion polarizes force against inertia, rest, or the ether. Understanding polarity is necessary if you have any hopes at all of, if you're interested in Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Neoplatonism, the works of Plotinus, Arianus, Damascus, Proclus, Numenius, the Pitaphesian, Advaita Vedanta, principal Upanishads. You can't understand it without understanding emanationism. You can't understand emanationism without understanding, I have a mosquito bite on the back of my leg, without understanding this principal attribute, which is not true polarity. Divergence and convergence, centrifugal and centripetal. These are all divisions or polarization through the dissipation of rest. This isn't a perfect analogy in the case of this battery here, but if I tap off and take the energy, or the rest energy, it's not perfectly rest energy, obviously, so it's a bunch of chemistry, but there's no negative charge or a negative pole on a battery. It's completely ridiculous. To say ground, or to say counter space, or to say 0 point, it's the same thing. I mean, we all know what an electrical ground is. That's absolutely no different than saying counter space. Cathode and anode. The anode is the south pole. That's the charging pole. That would be the larger part of, the bell-bottom part of an egg, for example. That would be the south pole, analogously. The cathode would be the north pole. There's a reason why it's colder in the moonlight. I made those videos using forward-looking infrared. It's like, look, it's true. It is colder in the moonlight. It's like, wow. Why? It's like, well, you need to think about that. Why is it colder in the moonlight? You really stumped everybody. It's called the cold cathode effect. Do a Google search. Type in cold cathode effect. You'll get 1 million hit results. It's warmer on the anode. So if moonlight is cold cathode effect, which it is, and what would be the anode, or the charging? There's things that deplete our energy, and there's things that charge our energies. And this, of course, is polarity of the universe, which is universal from galaxy to galaxy, all across the universe. Well, the charging anode would, of course, be the sun. Okay, so what would be the cooling cathode effect? Well, that would be the moonlight. North pole of a magnetic field is the cathode. The south pole of the magnetic field is the anode. There's a reason why, and of course water is a polarized molecule, there's a reason why seed exposure, and I've done countless videos showing this, and countless thousands of you have reproduced it, they grow way better underneath the south pole, like just seed exposure only, or seed and germination exposure underneath the south pole, radically better. They smell better, they taste better, they grow faster, they grow better than they do under the north pole. The division and polarity of this universe is divine, transcendent, irrefutable, immutable, and it is extremely simple. It's no more simple than this. It's called a toroflux, by the way. It's basically a child's toy. You have the rest, which is actually the transcendent one. This is about 1.5, and of course this is the second one. Principle and attribute, light and illumination. This is modulation. This is polarization. These are the antinomies of existence. I don't think people understand how universal this is. Magnetic polarity, the two cells, ether and space, space and gravity, force and inertia, centrifugal, centripetal, cathode, anode. A battery doesn't have a negative pole on it. The idea of a negative charge, once again, is not in accord with the laws of nature. The positive charges and the negative discharges. But that's no different than saying like a lightning ground. The discharge node, a ground node. I could call it a counter space node, but everybody understands what a ground is. Well, electricity is grounded. That would be the negative charge. No, it's not. It's a discharge node. This is the reason why all force vectors are curvilinear, because all force vectors are tied to the point of rest. This would be rest right here. There's a reason why all these vectors are curvilinear. They're all tied to the center here. What center? There's nothing there. That's the ether or rest by definition. Understanding polarity is actually divinely simple, but people are not taught this. People don't think about this. They never try to wrap their brain around it. Anyway, I hope you like these videos. I hope I kept it short and sweet. That's what I tried to do. I can expand on this more if you like. Thank you so much for watching. Lux Veritas. I hope you have a lovely rest of your week. And I'm going to go look at this mosquito bite. Something bit me. I was outside a little earlier. Darn mosquitoes. Thank you.